For champagne lovers, there are a few houses with the electric charge and extraordinary finesse of Lanson, which performs best with age. Known for blocking malolactic fermentation and extended lees aging, Lanson creates wines of extreme longevity and possesses a huge cache of the region's oldest champagnes. After a monumental program involving a quality check and stocktake of their museum wines, the Maison has launched a unique program called Lanson Private Collection, where investors will be allocated a private cellar with storage for up to 300 bottles and personally monitored by their chef de cab, Hervé Dantan. After experiencing the special launch dinner in Reims, where I had the chance to taste some extraordinary older champagnes going back to 1921, I sat down with Hervé Dantan for this interview. Okay, so Hervé, it's wonderful to have you with us today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
We were very recently together in Champagne, where I was lucky enough to be invited to a very special dinner to commemorate the launch of something unique, the Lanson Private Collection program, which is also one of Champagne's first ever private cellaring and concierge services. It seems like an obvious opportunity to provide collectors with space in Champagne cellars tied to an exclusive access to new and past releases, but no one has done anything quite like that, at least not on this scale. So under your new program, investors will be allocated a private cellar with storage for up to 300 bottles, which will be personally monitored by you. There are many benefits that provide some discount options, but also liquidity. I also really like the fact that you are providing some VIP services like private cellar visits and tastings at the Maison. It seems like a really different way to engage direct to consumer. So can you tell us what was the original thinking and motivation behind this idea?
The idea was at the beginning just an idea of organizing the collection of all vintage that we had in the library. So as I said, 4 years ago, we had no ambitions of selling old or younger vintage of Lanson, even if we used to already sell a Lanson vintage collection from vintage 1976 to 2002. But in 2021, we decided to reorganize and to move many different vintage that were spread all over our 7 kilometers of galleries. And when we began all this work, we thought it would have been very fast to do that. But we discovered that we needed to take the time to do things in better conditions, because by moving some old vintage, for example, magnums of 1959 or bottles of 1921, 28, we discovered some problems of cork, of wire, of pressure, of level of wine in the bottles or magnums. And we decided to take our time and to do things in better conditions to be sure that all the bottles and magnums that were kept in this Lanson collection were kept in the better conditions. That's why we decided also to create a kind of identity card for each of the bottles and magnums with a number that will enable now to know exactly the history of the vintage. How was the cork? How was the wire, the pressure, the level? What was the dates of disgorgement, the number of sugar that we added? So many informations that will enable in the future to check the quality of this collection when it will be possible to do it. So at the beginning, in 2021, the idea was only to collect and to reorganize this collection. But by having this work, we discovered that we had an incredible collection. We already knew it, but we didn't know exactly the quality of the conditions and the quality of the oldest vintage of the library. But by doing this work, by tasting and by checking all the different bottles and magnums, we decided to do something, because we had an incredible collection and it was a pity to sell a vintage from 1976 until 2002 and not to propose to many collectors, many people who have a very important level of knowledge about old vintage, to propose some older vintage 1976. And that's why we decided to launch this project of Lanson Private Cellar that will propose many vintage of Lanson, the youngest one, but also some oldest from the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s or 40s and 20, why not?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile noting as well for people who may not really know Lanson so well is that you have one of the deepest and most extensive inventories of old champagnes in the entire region. And you've had a huge opportunity really with a program like this to be able to offer some of those back vintages for the very first time, as you said, prior to 1976, to give people that really, wonderful insight into the ability of champagne wines to age incredibly well and particularly underneath the Lanson style. So it's a really beautiful offer. It's so unique for collectors who really want to access things that have been also preserved in the ideal conditions in their birthplace, so to speak. But also that massive undertaking of that program of yours where you had to go back and check every single bottle hand by hand is a huge undertaking, but it's also a great reassurance as well to people who do want to invest in those older wines that they are buying something that has been quality controlled, quality checked.
Sure. That's why we launched this new project. I think 4 years ago, we would not have been completely sure about what we were proposing. By all these controls that we did on this collection, today we are completely convinced that the quality of all bottles and magnums are perfect. We controlled everything.
Yeah. So what sort of interest have you had so far? Because you've only just announced it officially as of last week, but I know you said that already people have found out about it and have registered their interest in having their own private cellar. So I can imagine that this will actually catch on pretty quickly and you will get a huge amount of interest from people.
Yes, we already have some contacts from different countries, not only from France or Australia, but we have already many contacts from people who are collectors and who would like to have the accessibility for some vintage of Lanson. Not necessarily the oldest, but even from vintage from the 80s, 90s, and always with the idea of keeping them in the cellar. And for some people, you have the idea of heritage and transmission for sons or daughters, for example. It's nice, very nice.
So there are very few Maisons that have created a legacy on building incredible age-defying vintage champagnes. Lanson is one of them. There is an electric charge and an extraordinary finesse to Lanson wines. In youth, they are always super fresh, even a little bit on the austere side, but they perform really well with extensive aging. So can you, for the sake of those listening who want to understand more about what makes champagne wines age so well, can you take us through as a winemaker the building blocks that you use within the champagne winemaking process to make sure that they can age very well? We talk globally, I think, about acidity and sugar and phenolics, but it's more than this. So what are the essential ingredients for you as a winemaker to make sure that you are setting up that vintage for the future?
It's so complex, but sure that when we are talking about vintage, we are talking about 1 year. I mean, from one season, one climate. And when you are talking about 1 year, you are always talking about the history of the climate. So at first, you always have the climate that will influence the quality of the vintage. And what is always amazing is to taste vintage from the 90s, 80s, 60s, 40s, and to remember what happened at this time and to taste the wine and to think about which things have been influenced by the quality of the climate. So at first, the climate is very important to create the quality of grapes. After, the selection of grapes will be very important. Where do you take the grapes? At Lanson, we are using grapes that are only coming from Grand Cru at first. Our blend for vintage is always composed by around 52% Pinot Noir coming from Grand Cru of Verzenay at first, but some other Grand Cru from Montagne de Reims, like Verzy, Bouzy. You can have also some Grand Cru Hailly from Grande Vallée and Mareuil-sur-Hailly. But at first, it will be Grand Cru of Pinot Noir from Montagne de Reims and Verzenay. And we always blend it with Chardonnay. So around 48% of Chardonnay coming at first from Grand Cru of Côté des Blancs, like Avis, Cramant, Ménil-sur-Oger and Auger. And it's always possible to add also some Premier Cru of Chardonnay, like Trépaille or Villars-Marmerie from Montagne de Reims. So the selection of cru village is always very important. And after, you have the method of vinification. And as you said, the method of vinification at Lanson has been always very special since we block malolactic fermentation on vintage. You certainly know that we did some few change in the last 10 years by making some malolactic fermentation, but it's only for multi-vintage champagne. For vintage, we continue to be non-malolactic fermentation 100%, because we know that all our vintage will be kept at least 10 years, 15 years in our cellars, and that it will give a higher level of freshness at the beginning, but that this freshness will be perfect with the aging to give a wine that is always alive, even after many years of aging. As the tasting we did last week, it was amazing to see the level of freshness that we had. For example, with the 1952, that was absolutely incredible. Such an adult, a matured wine with a level of freshness, it was incredible. So the non-malolactic style allows this level of vitality in the wine that is always very interesting. And after the method of vinification, the amount of blending, and of course, the aging that must be as long as possible. So for a classic vintage, in the current range, for example, today we sell vintage 2013 that we kept 11 years in our cellar. So that's a very long time. So the wine acquired a very nice level of maturity with a very nice freshness, because 2013 was a late harvest. So the level of freshness is absolutely amazing. And after that, when we finish the sales of the vintage 2013, we always keep many bottles and magnums for a new life in our cellars before coming back in the selection of all vintages. So the process is always very long. And you have also all what is about the quality of what you do with the bottle, not the reading, but what you will do with the disgorgement. Because with the disgorgement, this is the last step in the winemaking process. But it's always very interesting to know what you did. When did you disgorge? What was the quantity of sugar? And do you have a fresh disgorgement or a null disgorgement? So it's always an information that is very important to understand the wine. And on the project of Lanson Private Cellar, all these informations will be the back label, since we will talk about the blend, we'll talk about the harvest, and we'll talk also about the dates of disgorgement and the quality of dosage.
Yeah. Yeah, really important information. You mentioned before about the crus that are very important to your style, and you touched on Verzenay, which is really at the heart of your Pinot Noir style. And in some of your much older vintages, as we experienced the other night, Pinot has come exclusively from this terroir in some years, which is really fascinating. So for those of us who know Champagne quite well, we know that Verzenay is, it's northerly. It brings a strictness and a freshness to the wines. And when you taste Verzenay Von Clair, for example, you can really pick it out quite clearly. There's always a very strong character to this particular cru. So can you talk us through maybe Lanson's historical connections to Verzenay, and what is it bringing to that vintage blend that's so important?
Yes, Verzenay is so important for Lanson. In fact, in the past, the Lanson family had a kind of secondary house in Verzenay.
Yeah.
Used to go in Verzenay during the weekend. They loved Verzenay. They loved people from Verzenay. They had many friends. And today we continue to be very well involved in the village of Verzenay, since we have a press house that is so important to collect grapes from our vineyard, but also from many different growers. So we have very strong links with Verzenay, with many families of Verzenay, many growers that are very faithful to Lanson. So that's a very important place for us. And moreover, the village of Verzenay is very special with its style. You said everything about the style of Verzenay, and sure that this very delicate, fresh style of Pinot Noir that we can have on Verzenay, that's completely different from Bouzy, for example, that is a richer, that's always a little bit more full-bodied. That is always also interesting. We use also some Verzenay, but Verzenay in its style is very close from the Lanson style. We are always talking about the freshness, delicacy, vitality, and in this Pinot Noir coming from a north exposition, we always manage to have a high level of maturity, but this level of freshness that is always amazing and that is so important for our wines. That's why we are always talking about Verzenay, and we are always using an important amount of Verzenay on our vintage.
Yeah. So what about Chardonnay though? Because I know that Pinot is incredibly important to the vintage blend and Verzenay in particular, but what about Chardonnay? Can you actually name a particular village, a particular cru that you think is absolutely crucial to elaborate your vintage collection champagnes?
I would say for Chardonnay, it's more a mix of different villages. The heart of Chardonnay vintage is coming from, I would say, Avis, Cramant, Ménil, Auger. They're always important. It's a kind of quadrature, four villages that are essential for the blends. And sometimes it's possible to have some Chouilly or even some Premier Cru of Trépaille or Villars-Mermery from Montagne de Reims that are always interesting. But the most important Chardonnay are coming from this part of Côte des Blancs.
Yeah. Okay. So a bit of a combination. So then can you maybe explain, I guess, the philosophical difference between the vintage collection and the Noble Cuvée, which is the prestige line of Lanson, and it's got a very different blend altogether. So philosophically, they're two different things. So what are you trying to achieve in Noble Cuvée that's different to the vintage collection?
Yes, for the vintage, I told you we have a blend that is on average a blend of 53% Pinot Noir, 47% of Chardonnay. So it's always a blend that is a bit more full-bodied. In this story, it was the first vintage that was made by the house, and the Lanson family used to love wines with richness, with body. That's why they had a bigger percentage of Pinot Noir than Chardonnay. And in 1979, the Lanson family decided to create a prestige cuvée, Noble Champagne, with a blend of higher percentage of Chardonnay, since in Noble Champagne, we have 70% of Chardonnay and 30% of Pinot Noir. 70% of Chardonnay coming exclusively from Grand Cru, the same Grand Cru I told you about, Avis, Cramant, Ménil-sur-Auger, Auger, Chouilly. The Pinot Noir coming at first from Verzenay. So the idea is to have wine that will be on high level of purity, delicacy, finesse, elegance. It's a kind of quintessence of the Lanson style by its level of freshness. And moreover, we are waiting for Noble Champagne a longer time than for the vintage. Since today, for example, we are selling Noble Champagne 2005, when the vintage that we sell now is vintage 2013. So for the vintage, we always have around 10 years of aging. For Noble Champagne, between 15 and 18 years of aging on lease. Okay. And when we are talking about Lanson Private Collection, we are talking about vintage, but we are talking also about Noble Champagne. So you can have a selection of Noble Champagne from 79, 81, 89, and 96, 98. So Noble Champagne. We also have Noble Blanc de Blanc. So it's also possible to have a selection of old vintage from Noble Blanc de Blanc. And we have to talk also about Clos Lanson. It's possible to put in your Lanson private cellar some bottles or magnum or of Clos Lanson. So you have the possibility to constitute your Lanson private cellar with vintage, Noble Blanc de Blanc, Noble Champagne, Clos Lanson.
That's really good to know. I didn't realize that was part of the program as well, but I know that there would be many people interested in all of those. So during the launch dinner that we had the privilege of experiencing last week in mid-April, we tasted our way through some of the most historically significant years for champagne. So 1996, 1985, 1971, 64, 52, 42, and 21. Can you provide maybe some insights around one or two of these? What makes them particularly remarkable? Maybe it's a favorite of yours. 1921, for example, I've experienced this a few times with different Maisons, and I still can't believe the vitality that comes through from the 21 vintage. It's incredible. It's just ever prevailing. So what sort of insights can you provide around some of these iconic vintages and why they're so great?
Oh, yes, it was such an amazing evening last week that we had with this tasting of all vintage. It's always moving to taste all vintage because you have to think about what happened in the year with the climate. That's what I said. And also, we are always thinking about people who made it. So it's always very moving to think
Mm.
about all these different specific points. So yes, all the vintage that we choose have a special history. For example, we began during the dinner because we began with 2013. That is the current vintage. 2002. And during the dinner, we began by 1996. That is a very special vintage in Champagne. It's a very iconic vintage that was an incredible vintage, characteristics of maturity that we never had in Champagne because we had in 1996 balance with the maturity that was very unique. We had 10 grams of acidity and 10 degree of sugar. So 10, such a special balance that was amazing and that gave wines with a level of vitality, of freshness that we never had in Champagne. So this vintage was with such a reputation as soon as its creation that it was amazing to see this level of demand on this vintage because since we had a high level of acidity, many people said this vintage will have an incredible ability to age a very long time. And today, when you taste a 1996, it's always amazing that nearly 30 years after its creation, this vintage with such a level of freshness. That's incredible. And we had these characteristics because the climate was very special during the summer of 1996 with a lot of light, with many sunny days, but the temperatures were very low during the day by keeping high level of freshness, high level of acidity in the grapes. The vineyard managed to produce sugar, but because of these low temperatures, kept a lot of acidity. And when you drink 96, you think about what happened during this summer that was very special. After that, we tasted 1985. That was also very special. 1985, it's a year with very important frost during winter. We had January 1985, 14 days at minus 25 degrees in the vineyard. So many plants have been destroyed, many vines have been destroyed by the frost. And we had a very late harvest because the vineyard needed to recover. The flower happened at the beginning of July. And we had a late harvest. But after a very cold winter, cold springtime, we had a very nice summer with a lot of sun, no rain at all. And the level of maturity was amazing. But the quantities were very small, very low. And we managed to have an amazing vintage that was superb when we tasted it. After that, we had 1971. That was a very special vintage, 1971, because it was a vintage made with a lot of storms during the summer. A lot of storms. It was amazing. So many storms that today, this year is the reference of storms in Champagne still now. But fortunately, the maturity was made in very good conditions and also with a high level of freshness. So 1971 was amazing by level of freshness. We had after that 1964 is an incredible vintage, 64, a very good vintage from the 60s, made with a very nice summer after a cold winter, cold springtime. But as soon as middle of May until the harvest, we had a very nice summer with some rain at perfect moments, but good yields, high level of quality, high level of sugar, good level of acidity. And I think 1964 was maybe the best of the best during this tasting. And 64 is really an incredible vintage of Champagne. And at Lanson, it was amazing to have it. After 64, it was a special vintage that we had for many reasons. We tasted 1952. We choose this vintage not only for its reputation, but because it was a vintage that was served at Versailles in Paris by President de Gaulle when he received President Kennedy and his wife at Versailles in 1961. So it was a very special moment. And moreover, for that vintage, we decided to serve the menu that has been used for this special event in 1961. So it was a course Bœuf Charolais Renaissance that was served, and it was amazing to have this wine with the same course that General de Gaulle and President Kennedy had more than 50 years ago. It was a
Oh,
special.
it's an incredible moment. And to see the pictures from that dinner as well, and the actual menu that they were presented with is, such a historically significant moment and really special for everybody there.
And the wine was amazing by its level of freshness. I remember I told it during the evening, 1952 was a vintage with a level of freshness that you can compare to 1996. Not the same one. And the wine was still alive. It was very impressive to feel this level of vitality that was everlasting. You can imagine that this wine in 50 years will still be here with the same level of freshness. So it was amazing. And we finished the tasting by two vintages that were very moving. 1942, a very special vintage because that's what I said. It was a vintage made during the Second World War. And you had to imagine that at this time, it was hard to find people to work in the vineyard. In Champagne, many growers were prisoners in Germany. It was hard to find things in the vineyard, for example, copper to fight against the mildew. So it was complicated to avoid disease in the vineyard. And it was also hard to find glass corks to bottle the wine. So a very special vintage 1942, but it was very amazing because the wine was really interesting by its richness and one more time by its level of freshness. And it was the original disgorgement that was served since this wine had been disgorged in 1952. So it was absolutely impressive. And maybe the most incredible wine was 1921 because it's always moving to taste an old champagne, but the quality was still here. It was incredible. And incredible also to imagine this wine made after the First World War by people who rebuilt the vineyard after phylloxera, who rebuilt the stocks of bottles after the war in Champagne. I was talking about what happened with Verzenay after the First World War and the phylloxera in Verzenay. Only 75 hectares stayed in the vineyard, whereas totally it was 500 hectares of vineyard. So it was only a small quantity of vineyard that was kept after all these terrible events. So we have to imagine that people at this time managed to make such a level of quality in the wine. It was very impressive to taste the wine. And it was like if you were drinking history. Champagne by thinking about people, by thinking about this vintage that was very special. The level of quality was amazing. The wine was just a little bit fizzy, but not with very tiny bubbles, but it was very, very moving.
Yeah, I think a lot of these bottles that were produced during adversity really are a story of craftsmanship as well, because they did have some limited resources available to them, as you say, whether it was labor resources or material from the vineyards, and for them to be able to produce an astounding level of quality. It really shows, I think, their ability to be very creative, very astute, and to be very mindful of what they have available and create something beautiful out of it nonetheless. So it was a really, really important and magical tasting that we went through. You mentioned about disgorgements and original disgorgements versus late disgorgements. And so we did taste mostly original disgorgements throughout the evening, but there were a few late disgorgements as well. But my preference were the original disgorgements. I felt that they were more charming, to be honest, and more interesting and quite well integrated. But I'd like to know from you as the winemaker, can you explain the difference between old and new disgorgements? How do you see them presenting ultimately in an older bottle of champagne? So what sort of impact do they have on the wine?
It can take a long time to answer to this question because it seems to be simple, but it can be very complicated. No, our experience of old disgorgement and new disgorgement is important. And we know that each time you can compare both new disgorgement or old disgorgement, you always prefer the oldest disgorgement. because the wine is always perfect. When you taste a fresh disgorgement, the wine seems always to be a promise, but you know that you will need to wait a few more months or years. So we always prefer the original disgorgement. But the problem of the original disgorgement could be the quality of the cork and of the aging. Sometimes you can be very disappointing by an original disgorgement if the cork is not in perfect conditions. That's why a fresh disgorgement can be also very interesting, because you will check the quality of the wine, you will taste it, and you will put a new cork and you will have a new disgorgement. So both are very interesting, always very interesting. When you have an old disgorgement, for example, 1921 that we tasted, or 1952, you always need to be very confident with the quality of the cork. In our Lanson private cellars, that's what we did. Since we controlled everything, and we know the quality of the original disgorgement is perfect. But when you didn't have these controls, it's always easier to have a fresh disgorgement, because you know that you will have control the pressure, the quality of cork, and the quality of the wine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add also that when you do the fresh disgorgement, for example, on an old vintage, you will reintroduce some oxygen in the bottle, and you will have a reaction that will have an impact on the wine, and the wine will need to recover some months or some years. Whereas when you have the original disgorgement, it means that the wine has been disgorged maybe 10, 15 years after the vintage. The wine will be younger, and it will react like a young guy when this young guy is operated, and it will recover very quickly. And when you disgorge an old bottle, the wine will need to recover a long time.
Yeah, it goes through that oxidative shock. So, Hervé, looking to the future, we know that there are more challenges around growing seasons. We're seeing them more and more every year, particularly warmer years. And also we've got more extreme weather, which somehow invokes varying diseases, which is very challenging, of course, for you when it comes to harvest time to have clean and quality fruit. So how do you see your vintage champagnes moving into the future? So do you see them as surviving the test of time like in years past? And strategically, is anything changing within your Maison to better prepare for this?
We always need to adapt to the quality of the grapes. We had to adapt to the quality of the climate we had in the season, and sure that we need to be more and more involved in the vineyard to see the quality of grapes, to check not only the quality of the sugar and the acidity, but also phenolics, taste the grapes, to be sure that the level of maturity is a good one. We had in the last decades some vintage made with global warming, when it was not only important to check the quantity of sugar, but also to check the real level of maturity between phenolic maturity and glycidic maturity. So that's something that's very important that we learn, I think, about some very special vintages from the global warming, like 2011 or 2015. And we know that we need to be very cautious with this kind of vintage. But by doing the experience, by having the experience that we had last week with many old vintages, when you think about the quality of vintage of the history of Champagne, and when you learn what happened in all the different years in Champagne, you have many vintages that were very complicated, even in the 60s, 50s, 40s, 2021. You had also some vintage made with some global warming, like 76, 59, 55, 47. And Champagne always managed to find the good balance with the maturity, with the acidity. And we know that the quality of a vintage is not only made at the quality of vinification, but everything is done at first in the vineyard. So that's where we need to be really involved to be sure that as soon as the beginning, the potential of the harvest will be here to make a great vintage. So everything has to be done to be sure that the balance between sugar, acidity, and phenolic compounds will be the good one for a great vintage.
Yeah. And so what about fruit sourcing though? You've obviously got very strong historical ties to the cruise that we spoke about before. But, strategically, are you having to think about alternative sources for fruit, knowing certain challenges that present, during the growing season? For example, I know with some other maisons, they're looking to terroir that I guess have never been part of the sourcing for them because they're looking for fresher alternatives, fresher sites that may in the past have struggled to ripen, but today they're achieving some ripeness. So, I'm just wondering if that's also a consideration for Lanson.
So that's a big consideration. And I would say that we are very confident because we have some very special cru, for example, that are famous for their freshness. We are talking about the north of Montagne de Reims with Verzenay, Verzy, all this part that is always very fresh, like Mailly as well. So we have important sourcing of grapes in this place. So I think it's good to resist against global warming. And I talk a little bit about Trépaille, Villers-Marmerie, for example. These Chardonnay that are very special, that are always more and more interesting by their freshness that is always kept in very special year. I could add Ménil-sur-Oger, for example, in Côte des Blancs, always very interesting wines that are built to age a very long time with a lot of freshness that is always very important. These crus are those that are always more and more interesting with global warming.
So I want to delve a little bit deeper into the collecting and cellaring potential of champagne, speaking with a number of people in the region, especially CEOs and other cellar masters. There seems to be an increasing interest in older champagnes, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. We know that at the top end in markets like Hong Kong and Tokyo, sommeliers are always searching for back vintages for their customers. But obviously, when you're dealing with the secondary market, provenance and condition of those wines can be a little bit uncertain. So, I want to know from you about your approach to this, what you think about it. How accessible do you make your older champagnes to this emerging market for back vintages outside of the collection program, of course? So how do you sort of approach the market and, and deal with this sort of increased interest now in back vintages?
It's always hard to say that we approach the market. I would say the market approach us because to be interested in all vintage, you need to know what it is. For people who don't have any knowledge about the wine, it's always complicated to discover on the old vintage of champagne. You need to have your own experience about a young vintage and older vintage. But for people who know, who have the level of knowledge to appreciate it, we know that people always become big fans of old champagnes. And they love to taste young and oldest champagne by being always amazed by the level of freshness that you have in older champagne. So what we want to do is always to be more concerned by a connoisseur and to be sure that all the people who have an interest in all vintage of champagne will think about Lanson because we have a big legitimacy to talk about all vintage by the quality of our collection, by the quantity of our collection, and also by the know-how that we have on all this vintage and on the current vintage and the vintage of the future, because we are ready also to continue and to improve the quality of our vintage with all the level of know-how that we have now.
Yeah. So just to conclude then, Hervé, you've had the privilege of tasting some of Champagne's most legendary wines from Lanson and from other producers as well. What are some of your very best memories?
I think my best memories is what we did last week. Because,
Good answer.
To taste an old vintage is always incredible, but it's not only the wine itself. It's also people you share, people who are with you. And it's always important to share with people that love it and to feel that people are very happy to taste it. So last week, it was amazing to have such an audience and to feel people who were so happy, so overwhelmed by this event. So it was a great event. And when you taste 1921, 42, 64, even the youngest 1996, it was incredible to share this incredible vintage. And what I love with all vintage is, yes, that's what I said with 1921. you feel you drink history of champagne. You feel what happened in 1 year. You think to people who made it, and like a technician, I think about what was done, and I said to myself, today we have so many things to control, to do wines in perfect conditions. And when you think what happened in 1921 or during the Second World War, it's a good school of modesty, because at this time people knew already how to make wine. And I hope that the wines that we make now will also be built for such a long future.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the great things about this initiative is that it allows, the broader church of champagne lovers to experience such magical moments like the ones you've just described, instead of just keeping it to a select few. So it's a really beautiful moment, not just for the Maison, but I also really feel for Champagne to really open its doors and be a lot more inclusive around this sort of sense of history and pride in the wines that have been created across that time of history. So I just want to say thank you, for inviting me to such a special experience and for sharing with an international community that we were on that evening. And I think all that incredible work you've done with your team since 2021 in restoring all those champagnes, what a huge legacy that is for you and for the Maison, and being able to celebrate that huge milestone today with all of those champagne lovers. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining us today and going through the program with us in detail and sharing your passion and knowledge as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. It was great to have you last week, and it was great to hear you commenting the different wines as well. I know that you did it very well with 1952. It was very nice to hear your incredible comments. It was a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. And we'll see you very soon. Thanks, Hervé.
Bye, Sarah.
Vine & Bubble is a boutique and independent information source dedicated exclusively to telling the real story of Champagne. It was launched by me, Sarah Underdown, in November 2018, after almost a decade of working in the champagne industry as a recognised writer, educator and presenter. Vine & Bubble brings together a network of Australian wine journalists, sommeliers, educators and industry representatives as regular contributors. As a team of champagne lovers and communicators, we are thrilled to share our united passion with wine-loving audiences. To read more about Champagne, to subscribe to events in Australia and learn more about opportunities to join us for experiences in Champagne, visit vineandbubble.com and register your details.